This split screen shows a persistent tension in the data. On one side, 69% of Canadians agree the federal government is legally responsible for resolving Indigenous social and economic problems. On the other, the map of British Columbia is covered in overlapping, unsettled land claims. Canada is built on a reputation of democratic stability, but that stability sits on a foundation of colonial systems engineered to manage land and resources. The current friction traced us back to 19th century policies designed to dismantle Indigenous sovereignty. This imperial framework redefined North America, creating structures the country is still attempting to reconcile. The resulting tension is the outcome of an unfinished historical process, a series of imperialist practices that remain deeply embedded in the legal landscape. European expansion into North America operated on two fronts: economic extraction through the fur trade, and a civilizing mission driven by religious conversion. Early interactions were often collaborative. Colonial governments and First Nations entered into treaties that, at least on the surface, were presented as sacred agreements between two equal nations intended to share the territory. However, the British and French brought a Eurocentric perspective that viewed these agreements very differently. To the colonial powers, these treaties were absolute surrenders of territory and sovereignty, a mismatch in definition that eventually eroded all good faith. This shift toward control required an ideological anchor. Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, provided the moral justification, framing imperialism as a difficult service Europeans provided to others. Kipling's language was explicitly paternalistic, describing Indigenous peoples as half devil and half child. This rhetoric transformed equal partners into wards of the state who required discipline and guidance. This redefined the relationship. It allowed the government to act as a self-appointed guardian, legally stripping Indigenous people of their adult agency. By the late 1800s, surging European populations and aggressive economic goals accelerated the physical takeover of the West. The Canadian Pacific Railway became the primary tool for this expansion. It carved up the territory and restricted Indigenous mobility, making it impossible for nations to hunt or fish on their own ancestral lands. To manage the people already living there, the government passed the Indian Act. This legislation crushed traditional governments, replacing them with band councils that reported to federal departments. This cartoon illustrates the three-step process of colonialist justice: ignore the owners, steal the resources through new laws, and then create courts to validate those same laws. Once the legal state of tutelage was established, the government began auctioning off Western lands to help build the empire, often without any consultation with the people living there. These policies were an engineered attempt to replace Indigenous independence with a system that cleared the way for Canadian expansion. The system of treating Indigenous peoples as wards of the state remained the status quo until 1969, when the Nisga'a Nation launched a legal battle to claim title to their traditional lands. In 1973, the Supreme Court of Canada reached a conclusion that challenged the colonial framework. It recognized that Aboriginal land title existed before settlers ever arrived. This ruling meant settlers entered organized societies with pre-existing land title. Indigenous sovereignty was interrupted, not destroyed. Advancing to today, we see a massive wave of legal challenges following that logic, reshaping the map with modern-era land claims. The 1973 ruling proved that the imperialist legal engine was built on a fallacy. The original owners never actually left. In 1996, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples provided a blueprint for moving forward, calling for an end to the vicious circle of grievance and denial. The Commission's primary recommendation was the restoration of Indigenous peoples as self-determining nations within Canada. This process relies on a continuing journey of feeling and rebuilding, led by Indigenous peoples themselves to reclaim the identity and agency that imperialist policies tried to suppress. While history cannot be undone, the modern legal and moral landscape requires moving past the paternalistic playbook of the 19th century. True resolution means returning to the concept of equal nation-to-nation partnership, the very relationship that imperialism